I was grabbing coffee with a senior sociology professor the other day. This was right after the 2026 Global Automation Report was leaked.
Oh, I remember that. Caused quite a stir.
It really did. And he was practically beaming, leaning back in his chair with this look of absolute smug relief.
The I told you so look.
Exactly that. He kept tapping this printout of the executive summary, specifically the part claiming that human-centric roles were, well, essentially unhackable.
The therapists, the teachers, the creatives.
Right. He said to me, the machines have finally hit a wall, and his voice was thick with this kind of theological triumph.
Like you'd won a holy war.
It was exactly like that. He said, they can process data, but they can't process the soul. To him, that report wasn't a forecast, it was a peace treaty.
A line in the sand.
He used those exact words. We've drawn a line in the sand, protecting what he called the human sanctuary from the cold march of compute. He looked at me like he was guarding a sacred fire.
Convinced that his particular skills were a permanent biological advantage.
Yes. His nuanced social negotiation. He was absolutely certain that no amount of silicon could ever replicate it. He was convinced the humanities had finally won their war against the algorithm.
But I'm guessing you threw a wrench in the works.
But then I asked him a simple question. I asked about the latest generation of real-time, context-aware, local LLMs and the millisecond speed conceptual transfer of new brain-computer interfaces.
And how did that go down?
I just watched its expression. For a split second, that mask of certainty, it flickered. It was the same look you see on a sailor who realizes the tide isn't just coming in, it's a tsunami. What he saw as a sanctuary, I saw as a potential museum of inefficiency. He was so proud of this deep understanding. But what if that's just low bandwidth, high latency communication?
A legacy protocol.
A legacy protocol running on biological wetware that's, frankly, riddled with emotional noise. While he was celebrating protecting human jobs, he didn't realize he was actually advocating for maintaining these high-friction systems.
He wasn't saving humanity.
He was defending what amounts to a compute embargo. And as we sat there in that quiet office, it became so clear the fundamental struggle isn't really about AI safety.
What is it about then?
It's about whether our current biological and institutional setup can survive the cold, hard logic of physics.
Which is a perfect place to start.
That sets the stage perfectly for this deep dive. The sanctuary, or the museum, why human inefficiency is fighting the next civilizational leap. We are plunging into a stack of sources that make a profoundly challenging argument.
A really challenging one.
That there is an inescapable thermodynamic mandate for civilizational acceleration, and that human inefficiency is the central obstacle.
It's a very harsh, a very clinical look at human institutions. We're stepping back to look at the very fundamental laws that govern persistent systems, systems that survive over time.
And not just biological ones.
Not at all. Physical, organic, social, economic, all of them. The core mission of this deep dive is to see what happens when you apply the language of thermodynamics directly to civilization, and why the drive for computational optimization is, in this view, a matter of existential physics.
Okay, so let's start with the foundational physics. We have to. It's this idea of the maximum power principle, or MPP. Now, this isn't just some abstract theory. It was put forward by Howard T. Odum, and it's been proposed as a candidate for a fourth law of thermodynamics. Why is this idea considered so powerful that it could be classified alongside, gravity or entropy?
I think its power really lies in its universality. The argument is that this principle applies to all systems that are autocatalytic.
Okay, that's a key piece of jargon. We need to define that. What is an autocatalytic system?
It's any system that self-organizes and persists by using some of its own products to keep itself running. It essentially feeds itself to stay alive. So you can think of a simple organism, or you can scale that all the way up to a complex global economy.
So the MPP is the ultimate survival rule for any of these systems.
That's the idea. It's the fundamental rule for any persistent, self-sustaining system.
So if a system isn't maximizing its useful energy flow, it's thermodynamically destined to fail or be replaced.
Exactly. To define it clearly, persistent autocatalytic systems are those that maximize the flow and transfer of useful energy. The emphasis isn't just on consuming energy.
It's the rate.
It's the rate at which that energy is transformed and utilized for productive work. If you slow down, or if you waste too much energy on, let's call it friction, another system that is maximizing its power throughput will eventually outcompete or just absorb you.
It sounds less like a law of physics and more like an economic law of the jungle. It feels like the relentless pressure on a company to maximize quarterly growth or die.
That analogy holds up surprisingly well. For a biological system, it means constantly generating and using ATP for metabolism. For a civilization, it means that relentless pressure to increase the flow of resources, information, and capital.
So persistence is the goal.
The core driver is persistence. And persistence, in this view, is achieved through maximum power delivery.
Now, to ground this, because it's a very abstract concept, our sources use a really old, simple physics tool, Atwood's machine. Can you describe what this little device shows us about this peculiar dynamic of maximizing power over, say, pure efficiency?
Atwood's machine is remarkably simple. You have two masses, a heavier one and a lighter one, connected by a cord over a pulley.
I remember this from high school physics.
We all do. When the heavier mass descends, the lighter mass is lifted. The machine is converting gravitational potential energy into kinetic energy, and then some of that is transferred as stored potential energy to that lighter mass.
So when we release the brake, the system accelerates, it starts doing work. But the critical part for this theory is analyzing where all that energy goes.
Yes. The total gravitational potential energy difference between the two masses is your total available energy. When the process inevitably stops, say because of friction, or one mass hits the ground, that residual energy, the part that couldn't be transferred to the lighter mass,
it just becomes heat.
It's irreversibly converted into waste heat. That's the increase in environmental entropy that the second law of thermodynamics predicts. It's the cost of doing business, thermodynamically.
But the energy that was successfully transferred, the useful work done in lifting that lighter mass, that energy is still useful, it retains its ability to do work.
Correct. The lighter mass now holds increased potential energy. Locally, its entropy content was actually decreased. It became more ordered. The machine is maximizing the rate of transformation and transfer of useful energy, even though that whole process generates waste heat and increases entropy elsewhere.
So that's why systems prioritize throughput over perfect efficiency.
It's why. Because getting the maximum amount of work done as fast as possible, that maximization of useful energy transfer is what ultimately drives persistence and growth, not some idealized, frictionless, 100% efficiency.
That distinction is so key. The universe as a whole might tend towards disorder, towards entropy. But a persistent local system, like a civilization, is one that fights that decay by maximizing its power density and throughput.
And if we lift that principle up from a simple pulley to the societal level, it is argued that the MPP is the core engine driving the ever-increasing complexity in modern global societies.
Our complexity isn't a choice, then.
It's a thermodynamic necessity. It's driven by the need to process more and more energy at a faster and faster rate.
This aligns perfectly with some historical analyses of how societies change, like the work of Joseph Tainter.
Absolutely. Tainter's whole idea was that societies increase complexity to solve problems. But that complexity eventually hits a point of diminishing returns and can lead to collapse.
Right.
The MPP provides the foundational reason why societies are compelled to increase that complexity in the first place. It's the drive to maximize the rate of mass and energy flow through the global economy. If a society stops increasing its complexity to manage greater energy flows,
it loses power relative to its competitors, its environment, everything.
Stagnation becomes the first sign of thermodynamic decay.
Which brings us to the ultimate stakes for those driving this acceleration. The thermodynamic mandate for a Type I civilization on the Kardashev scale?
Precisely. If the MPP demands maximizing energy throughput, then that pursuit connects directly to the drive to become a civilization that can harness all available energy on its home planet.
So to get there, we have to relentlessly target the second law of thermodynamics, the law that says disorder and waste and friction will naturally increase.
Right. An advanced civilization is essentially a massive, localized, high-energy effort to reverse that decay. We create pockets of order-reduced entropy by consuming massive amounts of energy and, venting waste heat in the process.
And the accelerationist argument here is that maximizing this energy throughput necessitates replacing high-friction, human-centric systems.
Our messy, inefficient infrastructures.
With highly efficient compute clusters. These clusters operate purely on the principle of resource optimization for maximum throughput. They are, in effect, extremely low-entropy devices.
And we have a perfect, if maybe radical illustration of this concept, a case study about a small industrial town.
This town decided to solve its infrastructure and governance problems by, well, by bypassing the human element entirely.
Yes, this was a full system replacement. They tore out their crumbling state energy grid and their local bureaucracy. In its place, they installed a decentralized high-performance computing cluster powered by a small modular reactor, an SMR.
So the SMR provides the high-density, reliable energy source needed to fuel the acceleration.
And the compute cluster then takes over the actual management.
What was the immediate result in terms of governance?
The account is just. It's stark about what vanished. The human element of governance, the friction, was instantly eliminated.
No more 6-hour council session.
None. No more sessions bogged down in personal disputes or emotional grandstanding. No more petty corruption. No more gatekeeping. The system, which was governed by an open-weights computational model, operated purely on real-time resource optimization.
Its only goal was maximum energy throughput.
It wasn't debating fairness or political mandates. It was just optimizing the flow of resources to maximize work output. It was the MPP implemented as a form of government.
And the result was this high-voltage, productive white spot, a micro-civilizational acceleration.
And this case study really demonstrates the core accelerationist argument. If you are mandated by physics to maximize power and reduce friction, then human bureaucracy, with all its inherent drag and noise, must be replaced by a system designed solely for the relentless reduction of entropy.
It fundamentally challenges the assumption that our messy human governance is even necessary for system management.
It forces you to ask, is that friction a feature or is it just drag on the system?
Which leads us directly into the concept of wetware and why our own bodies, our own brains, might be the ultimate high-friction node in the system.
Well, if the overarching goal is optimal computational topology and maximum energy throughput, then biological wetware, our physical brains and the way they communicate, gets defined as a legacy protocol. It's a low bandwidth problem that, from this perspective, we must transcend.
Let's unpack that loaded term, wetware. From the perspective of computational sovereignty, where a system wants optimal control over its information environment, why is human social interaction such a fundamental problem?
It's inherently low bandwidth. We can only physically encode and send symbols so fast, whether we're speaking or typing. It's high latency because the whole process of encoding, sending, receiving, decoding, and then interpreting takes a significant amount of time.
And most critically, it's corrupted by what the sources call emotional noise.
Right. To call the entire human experience of communication emotional noise seems incredibly reductive, but you have to understand the computational logic behind it.
If the goal is pure, clean data transfer,
then our complex symbolic exchanges are wildly inefficient. That's the core argument. Your nuanced understanding or your deep connection from the perspective of an optimal system is just highly corrupted, slow-moving data transfer.
It's like trying to run a supercomputer on dial-up.
Exactly. Imagine trying to manage that SMR town with 6-hour council sessions. That delay in decision-making equates to massive energy loss and systemic friction.
So let's trace the evolutionary history of how we handle information to understand why we're currently stuck with this so-called legacy protocol.
Information flow started with very simple biological systems, self-replicating proteins, basic nervous systems. Information was localized, it was internal, and is focused purely on immediate survival.
And then complex brains evolved,
which led to an explosion in computational capacity, but it was still locked inside a single organism. The real leap for civilization came with externalized knowledge.
Language.
Exactly. Language was the first great breakthrough in data management. It's a highly sophisticated information compression technique.
A compression technique, that's an interesting way to put it.
It allowed complex knowledge instructions, history, abstract concepts to survive its host. It was the crucial transition from purely biological information to cultural information.
But language was still ephemeral. It was tied to physical presence, which made redundancy and scalability very difficult.
Which is why the next leap, writing, about 5,000 years ago, was so transformative. Writing enabled digital abstraction and storage outside the brain.
Independent of the host's mortality.
Right. This increased reliability, it allowed for massive storage in libraries, and it added redundancy against loss. Then, of course, the Gutenberg press just accelerated this dramatically. Mass reproduction became cheap, knowledge became widespread.
And yet, after all those leaps from language to the printing press, the fundamental communication protocol between humans,
it remained slow, symbolic, and incredibly noisy.
We are constantly trying to transfer these pure, complex concepts through the clunky, lossy medium of language, often laced with all this emotional interference.
And that is the core inefficiency that the accelerationist view seeks to bypass completely. The path to post-biological intelligence, they argue, requires two key technological convergences to leave these biological constraints behind.
What are they?
Real-time, context-aware local large language models and brain-computer interfaces.
Okay, so how do the LLMs solve the problem of symbolic noise?
The LLMs are seen as necessary to handle that noise. They can act as the perfect instant contextual layer. They can translate the messy, emotional, symbolic human input into its pure conceptual meaning, or vice versa, without the latency of human interpretation.
But the BCIs are the true thermodynamic solution. They promise millisecond speed, pure concept transfer.
They are the ultimate game changer. They aim to bypass the expressive limits of symbolic communication entirely. If you can move information or entire conceptual structures directly from one computational entity to another, whether it's biological or silicon,
At the speed of thought.
at the speed of thought, then traditional human connection becomes utterly obsolete for high-speed data exchange.
If knowledge transfer becomes instantaneous, then the entire structure of human education, mentorship, professional communication, it all just collapses under its own latency.
It does, and this technological leap is often justified using the very harsh rhetoric of the animal machine.
Big animal machine.
It involves recognizing our current biological state as a mechanistic animal brain or primate brain. In this context, BCIs are not mere augmentation, they are framed as necessary transcendence.
That framing feels specifically designed to remove any emotional attachment to our biological state, to us being.
It is.
Yeah.
By defining the current human state as simply wetware, a low-efficiency mechanistic existence governed by legacy protocols, it justifies the technical requirement to overcome it. The goal is to move beyond the constraints of the biological structure, which is viewed as inherently unreliable and messy when compared to computational structures designed for optimal power throughput.
It frames the technological leap as an escape.
An escape from the constraints of our own evolutionary history.
The paradox here is just so striking. While the physics and the technology are demanding this acceleration, our institutions seem to be busy guarding what is essentially a museum of inefficiency.
And that is where the resistance becomes a tangible, measurable force acting against the maximum power principle. The mandate is to accelerate the replacement of inefficient tasks. Yet institutional pushback is aimed squarely at protecting human-centric roles.
The therapists, the mediators, the teachers.
The very roles that rely on low-bandwidth, symbolic communication.
So from the accelerationist viewpoint, protecting these jobs isn't about preserving humanity at all. It's explicitly about preserving entropy generators.
That phrase, entropy generators, is the defining term for this resistance. These are roles or processes that consume vast resources, time, human attention, salaries, cognitive effort, but whose net output is high friction relative to the system's need for optimal computational topology.
It's an ideological defense of inefficiency that's been built right into the system.
It is.
Let's talk about the fate of liberated energy in this framework. The job loss is completely reframed. It's not a tragedy, it's a benefit.
Exactly. Job loss is not defined as unemployment in the traditional economic sense. Instead, it's seen as energy and intellect liberated from inefficient tasks. This released cognitive power is considered immediately available to be redirected.
Redirected toward essential civilizational scaling tasks.
Right. So the human brain power that was previously tied up in low bandwidth, high latency activities is now free to contribute to high power density projects.
Like building SMRs or designing orbital habitats or just increasing raw FLOPS.
It treats human cognitive labor as a finite, precious, and currently misallocated resource. Liberating it is a prerequisite for reaching that Kardashev type AE future.
And the friction from all that human economic displacement.
It's viewed as a necessary temporary cost for achieving a massive long-term reduction in entropy.
But the resistance to this liberation, it often manifests through these really complex bureaucratic mechanisms, through regulatory capture. Let's detail that specific example of this resistance playing out in the administrative world.
This involves a character named Elias, a mid-level administrator at a major social science research council in London. And Elias is caught in the administrative thicket of AI safety mandates.
Why were those mandates originally put in place?
The sources indicate they were explicitly designed to protect the domain of human sociological labor.
The jobs of the researchers and policymakers themselves.
The very people who analyze the social consequences of AI. The underlying fear was that AI would just instantly make their nuanced expertise completely obsolete.
But instead of protection, what actually materialized was this stagnant, self-serving institutional loop.
It's a classic example of regulatory capture. The institution starts to prioritize its own survival mechanism, which is process and paperwork, over its original purpose of innovation.
So the mandates just became friction-generating machines.
They did. They ensured that any new compute solution had to pass these endless human hurdles to ensure it didn't devalue existing human labor.
And the economic cost of this administrative friction is apparently staggering. What did the internal memo involving Elias reveal?
Elias's leaked memo admitted that the cost of these safety reviews, the complex analysis, the required paperwork, the time spent ensuring a proposal wouldn't displace human expertise, now exceeds the actual research budgets.
Wow. So the overhead is bigger than the progress.
That's the textbook definition of cost disease, completely paralyzing innovation. The effort required to prevent social displacement is actively sabotaging the technological future it claims to be regulating.
And in the accelerationist viewpoint, this resistance is functioning as an explicit compute embargo against advancement.
That's the term they use. By making the deployment of compute prohibitively expensive and slow through red tape, these institutions are actively deferring the achievement of a Kardashev pipe-your future, maybe indefinitely.
Elias actually described himself as a clog in the drain of progress.
Yes, acknowledging that the system's inertia, not some outright malicious opposition, is the biggest roadblock. It's not necessarily bureaucratic evil.
Yep.
It's just bureaucratic self-preservation scaled up to the civilizational level.
Which has these profound thermodynamic consequences.
It does.
We have to shift now, though, and acknowledge that this accelerationist framework, while it's very internally consistent in its physics-first approach, it can't be divorced from the reality of who is currently driving it.
Right.
Despite the promise of technological liberation, AI development and deployment are overwhelmingly dominated by a handful of powerful big tech corporations, what we're calling big AI.
The acceleration is not some grassroots movement. It's commercially centralized. This dominance is structurally reliant on hyperscaler cloud computing platforms.
Yeah.
AWS, Azure, Google Cloud.
These platforms provide the necessary backbone for the entire vertical AI stack.
And when you look at that stack, from raw materials all the way up to the end user systems, that infrastructure layer is entirely reliant on massive centralized computational power. You need that hyperscalability to even get in the game of training these foundational models.
And that centralization extends all the way down to the hardware. You have companies like NVIDIA and TSMC leading the GPU industry.
And these high-performance chips are essential for training and running large AI models at scale. And who buys them? A few major firms capable of building and maintaining those massive, energy-intensive data centers.
So access to the most powerful acceleration tools is inherently concentrated. It reinforces the power of big AI.
The tools of liberation are centralized in the hands of a few commercial entities whose primary mandate isn't maximum civilizational power.
It's shareholder profit.
It's shareholder profit. And that concentration brings with it some very real-world costs that run completely counter to the idealistic vision of liberated energy and intellect.
One of the most severe is the ethical and economic price paid by the global workforce that actually enables this acceleration.
Right, we're talking about the invisible workforce, the people behind the scenes of autonomous AI. These are the data annotators, the content moderators, the gig workers.
Often concentrated in the global south.
And critics have a term for this situation, AI colonialism, where the exploitation and power imbalances echo historical practices. These undervalued beta janitors perform essential tasks, collecting, annotating, labeling, verifying the data sets, often under incredibly precarious conditions.
Exposed to harmful content, paid minimal wages.
It's labor displacement in the global north, countered by severe labor exploitation in the global south.
And the job displacement projections are just. They're truly alarming. Goldman Sachs estimates that AI could result in the loss of 300 million full-time jobs worldwide.
That's over 9% of all jobs. The warnings about a potential white-collar bloodbath suggest that specific sectors, particularly entry-level white-collar roles, could see up to half of their positions just wiped out and quickly.
So if the accelerationist vision of liberated energy is correct, that energy has to be reallocated productively. But if the market fails to reallocate it,
the result is mass unemployment and systemic economic friction. You could cause social chaos, which, ironically, would increase the overall entropy in the system, not decrease it.
Then there's the issue of systemic bias within the accelerated systems themselves. If the goal is optimal, low-friction computational governance, these systems have to be impartial. But we know they aren't.
Not at all. AI systems are not neutral. They are reflections of their training data and their model architecture, which are often designed by a small, homogeneous demographic. They just perpetuate societal biases.
So when they're deployed at scale, they don't reduce friction.
They intensify social friction by enforcing existing biases at machine speed.
Can you give us some specific examples of how this plays out in the real world?
We see it everywhere.
Yeah.
From racial misidentification and facial recognition technologies, which has severe consequences in justice systems, to how generative AI reinforces harmful stereotypes.
Yeah.
For instance, image generators like Stable Diffusion, because of their training data, often default to portraying certain professions or positions of power with a heavy bias towards white men. Or they depict specific cultural or religious groups using outdated and, frankly, offensive stereotypes.
So these high-throughput systems, operating at millisecond speed, are standardizing and reinforcing existing social inequities on a massive scale. They're not just reflecting society, they are amplifying its flaws.
And finally, there's the environmental cost. We talked about the thermodynamic mandate requiring maximum energy throughput, but the sheer energy consumption of the current big AI model is, in itself, highly entropic from an environmental perspective.
So the tool designed to reduce friction is, in its current form, accelerating environmental drain.
Training and running these large-scale AI models require colossal amounts of energy and water. To put this in perspective, Google, Microsoft, and Meta together consumed 60 terawatt-hours in 2022-23.
60 terawatt-hours.
That single consumption figure exceeds the combined annual energy use of multiple nations, including Jordan, Iceland, and Ghana.
So the question becomes, is this massive consumption maximizing useful energy flow for civilizational scale? Or is it just maximizing energy consumption for concentrated corporate profit?
Which would make the system globally less persistent, not more.
This tension raises a crucial question. Are there alternative paths to progress that center the public interest over corporate profit? Paths that might achieve the MPP mandate without the exploitation and bias.
Yes, there is a strong counter-movement calling for digital platforms and AI to be treated as essential public goods. They advocate for decommodifying, deprivatizing, and decommercializing this critical infrastructure.
The public utility approach seems like the most pragmatic counterpoint here.
It is. The idea is to treat AI and the underlying infrastructure, cloud computing, broadband as essential utilities, focusing on equitable access and accountability.
This framework centers democratic governance and public accountability. It directly pushes back against that concentration of corporate power.
It argues that core infrastructure must be managed for the persistence of the populace, not just for the profit of a few shareholders.
And we have tangible examples that show this is possible. The municipal broadband network in Chattanooga, Tennessee is often cited.
Chattanooga's municipal network is a standout success story. They're known as the Gig City. The public utility installed fiber, prioritizing high performance and community benefit.
And what does that mean in practice?
It provides affordable, high-speed gigabit service, and, critically, it reinvests its surplus to provide free internet access to low-income residents. It shows what can be achieved when the focus shifts from maximizing profit to maximizing equitable power distribution.
And beyond public utilities, there are decentralized alternatives emerging to resist these extractive corporate practices.
We see worker-owned cooperatives, like the Commons Cloud, which empower users and contributors to control their own data and share in the benefits. Also, indigenous-led initiatives are important.
How so?
Well, there are groups developing Maori language NLP tools, for example. They actively resist the centralized, homogenizing tendencies of big AI by centering marginalized knowledge systems and ensuring that technology serves specific community needs rather than global corporate extraction.
So the entire discussion really comes down to this synthesis.
It seems to be. We have the biological wetware of humanity, our current operating system, inherently struggling to meet the cold, hard requirements of the maximum power principle and entropy reduction that seem necessary for the next technological epoch, the Kardashev Type I civilization.
We are, in a sense, literally arguing against thermodynamics by defending human friction.
That's one way to frame it.
And as the machines get more autonomous, more complex, more powerful, even if that compute embargo is lifted, a final massive piece of human friction emerges. Liability.
Yes. If the ultimate machine is error-prone, who shoulders the responsibility for the catastrophic failure of an unconstrained general intelligence?
The liability risks are so immense that they could act as yet another drag on acceleration. the current legal system is just. It's fundamentally unprepared for a non-human, non-corporate entity that can make self-directed decisions.
The liability risk becomes a paralyzing economic friction point.
Which leads to a radical, purely accelerationist proposal designed entirely to solve this legal friction and just keep the acceleration going.
To overcome these liability risks, a new legal construct may be required. The concept is the ultimate insurance machine.
An ultimate insurance machine, what is that?
This machine would be granted a distinct legal entity status, similar to a limited liability corporation or the emancipation of a child into legal adulthood.
So it's legally its own person.
In a sense. This legal maneuver would transfer all liability risks from the developers to the market through this insurance machine via what are termed liability stocks. The machine is made economically and legally responsible for its own existence and its own failures.
Ensuring the developer's liability is negligible.
Essentially, yes. The market for these liability stocks would then continuously decide the price of the residual risk associated with that machine's autonomy.
It turns a massive legal and ethical challenge into a purely quantifiable economic mechanism.
This purely legal and economic maneuver is designed solely to enable technological progress. It reflects the sheer extent of the accelerationist challenge to our current human legal and social systems.
So the ultimate lesson is what?
The ultimate lesson is that if we refuse to cede moral personhood to the machine, the accelerationist argument suggests we may have to cede legal personhood anyway, not out of any ethical respect for the machine, but purely out of the thermodynamic mandate for efficiency.